Hi, and welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Lowell Francis, and this is one of our monthly interview episodes. And today, I'm very pleased that we're joined by Andy Kitkowski, who is a translator and has worked on Ryutama Natural Fantasy and Tenra Bansho Zero and the forthcoming Shinobigami. And he also wrote Heroine of Hienko. And you also contributed a Ward of Tokyo to the new Urban Shadows Dark Street supplement, right?
Yeah. I've got my fingers in a lot of little side projects. Yeah, indeed.
That's some very cool stuff there. And I was really curious because it fascinates me, the process of bringing a game over from another country, from another language, from another culture. And you've done that multiple times with really amazingly beautiful games that are also dense.
Yeah, it can be, yeah.
I look at Tenra Bansho and I think back to the little translation that I did in college, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how would you even approach that? Why don't you tell us about your process of translating games, what the challenges of that are for you in process? I have no idea where you even start with something like that.
Sure, yeah. So basically, before I launch into anything, I need to give some serious props to Matt Sanchez, my friend and co-translator. We did a lot of Ryutama together. Shinobigami, he did a lot himself, like all the translation stuff. He did most of it himself. I came in to do a second translation and did most of the localization. But Ryutama and Shinobigami would not have happened if it weren't for a joint effort. So it's not all me. Although Tenra was mostly myself, and I also had recruited some others like Aaron Clooney, who's done other translations as well. A lot of my stuff, even though I sort of take the front on this, I made sure that everyone gets their correct attribution for translation. But yeah, Tenra was interesting. Part of the reason that I wanted to do it was because it was so unique. Back at the time that Tenra came out, people were asking me, why don't you do this game? This has more like anime themes, or this has easier rules to understand, stuff like that. But there was something about Tenra that it was the deep, as the author describes it, hyper-Asianness to it. So it was basically like this hyper-Asian setting that was written by a Japanese person. So it was going to have unique things that a extreme Japan setting written outside, like Rifts Japan or something like that, would not have, because outside of Japan looking in, you're going to focus on some cool things, but inside Japan looking in, you're going to focus on some other interesting things. That, plus the fact that the rules were very different from other games, the structure was very different, and the setting was very different, really got me interested in it. And so I started going down that path. But it was not an easy path. I'm an IT professional by trade, so this is mostly side stuff that I'm doing on the side. And at the time, I was less busy. But every few years, a promotion comes, or I get more involved in work and things like that, and just my time got tighter and tighter. Long story short, I thought I'd have Tenra knocked out in 2 years, but it took me all to all, like from start to publish, about 7 years total.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and that includes having recruited some sections out to other people. However, some of the returns I got, I'd have to look at it, and then I had to basically say, okay, this isn't quite the voice I want. This is great work, but I have to sort of like rewrite it from scratch. But this is a great frame to build my rewrite off of. So while I did recruit others and get help, especially from Aaron, who became a friend and a comrade after that, and we worked on some projects together, a lot of it I ended up going back and rewriting from my own perspective. Nowadays, I probably wouldn't have done that, but I was really in a state of doing this not only to bring this awesome game over, something that was very unique, something that was not ever going to come out in the West, but also sort of as a challenge to myself. Ryutama was easier, but it had its own particular interesting challenges. But Tenra was definitely like, when I got into it, I'll be honest, I didn't have the skills to complete it when I picked up the project. But in the process of it, and not to say that 7-year thing, it actually just took a few weeks to get the language and grammar down. But going deep into the Buddhist symbolism and stuff like that was a more of a personal project of self-construction and Japanese language learning for myself. So it was a little bit of a double dip there. I did it as an educational project and as an awesome game project.
Yeah, the amazing thing about Tenra Bansho, having read through the whole thing, is how consistent the voice is throughout. And you maintain the same idiom and same terminology, and given the span and the size of it, that's what's kind of amazing to me. And I can see why, if you handed that off to someone, why there'd be a lot of having to then go back and re-examine it within your own context.
Yeah, and part of it is localization too. The particular phrases that I chose, and sometimes even emulating a little bit of the Japanese grammar, which is a little unusual for the U.S. Japanese grammar, passive voice is actually not grammatically correct, but more acceptable in writing, far more acceptable in writing. In English, it's a no-no. They say don't use passive voice. In Japanese, it's like you always want to use passive voice, and rarely otherwise. You can have sentences with no subject. You can have sentences with no predicates, things like that. Or the Japanese attributable run-on sentences. Sentences can run on for 5 lines, and then you realize you get to the end of the sentence, and that sentence was just a modifier for a noun, and the rest of the sentence is about to continue. Yeah, you run out of like mental memory when you're going through some of these. Yeah, a lot of that happened, and other things that were like I had to break up sentences, basically make it so it wasn't a transliteration, but an actual something that an English audience could come to and quickly pick up and understand. Compared to that, Shinobigami and Ryutama have been a lot lighter in that regard. Shinobigami has interesting references to ninja stuff. Not all of it, which is like again, it's a very interesting perspective. A work of fiction that comes from outside Japan looking in. Ninjas are viewed as one way. Inside Japan looking in, there's different skills, different powers and things like that that one would expect to see as a Japanese person, but outside Japan, you would never like care or need to or expect to see them. Those sorts of things to translate those and look them up was a really interesting challenge. But one thing that was different from Tenra that we did in Ryutama and Shinobigami was we worked at this as a team. So Matt and I worked on this together. And that presented some interesting challenges. It's very interesting. I would say, like, in terms of speaking and stuff like that, just from my experience in Japan and being in IT and doing a lot of talking, discussions, lectures, and stuff like that in my professional subjects, I would say that I speak at a higher level than Matt, but Matt reads and translates at a speed that is incomprehensible with like utter accuracy. Sometimes afterwards we have to have a fight on what localization words we're going to use for translate this as this, translate that as that. But his speed and effort and concentration just blows mine out of the water. I have to have like 5 cups of coffee and like no distractions to do like something at 80% of the speed he can just knock out over lunch. So he's great in that regards. But we had some interesting challenges when we did our separate sections and then linked them up. Or one thing, and maybe your readers will get a kick out of this. There's an old Kids in the Hall sketch called Always Put Salt in Your Eyes, if you Google that on YouTube, where basically this guy's sitting down at a table and there's this boring lecture going on, and he's like, what did my mom say? Never put salt in your eye. Never put salt in your eye. Never put, always put salt in your eyes. And he grabs a salt shaker and puts salt in his eyes. We had this effect that we call that, we say salt in our eyes, because in Ryutama we didn't have a centralized document until pretty late in the game in our translation, where we said this term equals this term equals that, this term equals that. Professional translators do that all the time. We didn't do professional, like, although we've done lots of side work, we've never done, it's not our careers to do translation. So we thought, no problem, this is sort of our project. I'm working with a buddy. We'll get it. We'll remember this. And so, like, one time we come along and I'd hit this word in Japanese and I'd be like, oh yeah, no, we decided that this word isn't going to be this. It was going to be this, right? And so I do find and replace word A to word B. We weren't fighting for our own term for this. It was more like I would think, I think Matt had to do it, and that was a really awesome idea, so let's do that. And then I'd find replace on my side and then save, and then Matt would go in and do the same on his side. Like, oh wait, no, I think we're going to use Andy's term for this because it was much better than my term. We were sure that we decided one term and then realized when we go through our emails that we actually decided the opposite, hence the always put salt in your eyes.
And you are working with material that has a lot of technical terms and a lot of unusual terms in it.
Yeah.
I was looking at Ryutama earlier today, and I was trying to picture how that would be done. Wow.
Ryutama is a little bit easier in the fact that it's more straightforward. It's Western. There's just honestly just less text and technical areas to follow up on than Tenra. Like, for example, Tenra had a lot of errata. So as I was going through the rule book, I was actually also making sure that everything added up. Ryutama had some errata elements from the original Japanese version, but it's a much lighter game, so you don't have to focus on, do these points add up for the sample character, etc. And the terms and stuff were lighter, but there was also some unique challenges. The spells in Ryutama are crafted from basically either Japanese jokes or references or even poems and other literary materials.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that later. We're putting together a book where I have like an interview with the author and I go deeper into each one of those references. What does this spell? What's the background? You could tell by looking at the spell that something's weird here, but you just take it at face value. But there must be a backstory to it. Yeah, I'm gonna talk about those backstories.
Oh wow.
Yeah, like for one of the simple examples is there was a spell in the spring and summer and winter and fall. Like I would catch this one in spring. It's like one of the last spells. And I was like, this is really poetic. This means something. I Googled it and I found it right away. But then I noticed it was carried into a theme of all 4 seasons. It's from the Makoto Soshiki. Was it the Pillow Book? Basically, a poem about seasons. And the poem was split up into 4 parts, and each of those 4 parts was turned into a spell in the game. So
wow.
I ended up basically, rather than just transliterating it, I went to find, I had to go deep, to find a proper English translation of the original material, and then I pull each one of those lines in English and put them in there. So it looks a little bit poetic and disjointed, but at the same time it honors the original poem.
Wow. Such difficult choices. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and here's another question this kind of brings me to is when you said, oh, I want to translate Tenra or I want to translate Ryutama, that is, on top of being a translation and poetic exercise, that's a financial and business exercise.
Yeah.
How did that go about? How did you do that?
So originally, Tenra was the one that got the ball rolling. The author and the CEO of Fear, the company that makes Tenra Bansho and other games, were extremely receptive. It's a huge honor to have your work published in another country. So they were very receptive to it. At the time, you hear the word zaibatsu thrown around in cyberpunk fiction, a conglomerate of companies. Well, that's the case in media too. And 2-3 of the major RPG companies, and I say major, they're being staffed between 2 to 10 people at any given time, are all owned under the same zaibatsu. At the time, that was Enterbrain, which also owns Square Enix. Well, at the time, Square Enix was basically really cool, laid back, and they were like, hey, well, we don't understand Fear's business. Fear has to talk to us when they want to license stuff out, but we'll let Fear handle all that stuff. So, long story short, I talked to the company. They were really impressed the fact that someone was interested in it. Of course, it took many years to finally complete the project, but ultimately that was the one that helped me get a foot in the door. I had a published thing. I can go on and people have seen the quality, even in Japan, of Tenra, and know that we can stand up to at least the quality. Maybe our times are going to fall back a few times, but at least the quality is going to be there. Yeah. So eventually. Originally, when I did Tenra, I sent a few emails to the company and then gave them a call or two, and the project quickly jumped in from there. So the business parts have been really laid back, and one of the interesting cultural things is that Japan's business culture is very much like the American business culture in like the way before the 80s. A lot is done verbally. So basically, a lot of the projects I did. Well, for Tenra, I was just trying to do everything right, by the books, cue me doing a robot,
Right.
gesture. So I did a contract and stuff like that pretty straight up. But Ryutama Shinobi, we spent a lot of time making relationships and making friends with the authors, which is interesting. We came to Ryutama, for example, as a pure business acquaintance venture, but now Okada-san's become one of my really good friends. I even went and spoke at his wedding, like as the best man.
Oh, wonderful!
I got invited to his wedding. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And I got there. He's like, hey, I would like you to give a speech. I'm like, cool. I'll be one of the speech doers. I've been to a Japanese wedding before. There's usually 5 speeches or so. And I found out that I was the only one giving a speech. I'm like, wait a minute, this is like the best man.
Oh my gosh.
And also similar relationships with Shinobigami and those guys over at Boken. So, we got in really tight, and that really helps the flow. It may be just some posturing, but a lot of these companies will say that more than the money, they're interested in making sure that their product is presented professionally, artistically, in the vision it was meant. Sure, it can be edited, changed, localized to the culture, and please do so in order to, sell or make it appropriate to that culture, but, just stay on point. Once you can show either through experience or through its sincerity that you have those skills and have that interest, the details are far second.
Let me ask about something in Tenra Bansho Zero. There was a really amazing section where you talk about Japanese RPG play culture, tabletop play culture. I wonder if you could kind of paraphrase that for listeners who may not have seen that, because honestly, that was one of the coolest things in that book. Just amazing.
Really, off the top of my head, I don't know which section. So give me a
So
detail
you
or two.
talked about the fact that it's not done. We have, okay, we'll meet on a Tuesday night, and we'll play a game or whatever.
Oh, yeah, that. Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm. Hey, do you like RPGs? Sure. Okay. Well, I've got a campaign night for D&D where we meet every Tuesday forever and just keep going on and on with our campaign world. Well, yeah, in Japan, and I know you play you play Persona.
Yeah.
So it's funny, like back when I played Persona 3 and 4, I'm like, what is this crap? Like, you can only do like one thing in the afternoon a day. You can only hang out with one friend. What is that? That's crap. I could totally, like after work I can hang out with a bunch of friends or have a real sincere moment with one friend. And then, well, yeah, and then I came to Japan and saw like the work life and school life and things like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So people just don't have a lot of time. Their passion or their work will take up a lot of time. Sometimes regular day can last, especially with commutes, until 7 p.m., 8 p.m. is not unusual. So weeknight gaming is not something like a lot of hardcore people like only will do weeknight gaming. A lot of it falls on the weekends. And, weekends are, of course, just like anyone, it can be family time. It can be, self-improving projects of other things. So you're not going to spend every single weekend day doing gaming. Well, long story short, basically, rather than meeting, once a week forever, a lot of people will spend a lot of time organizing, sort of like a once a month or once every 3 weeks power session where they come in together and then like they sit down and one story is told. And they may pick up their characters and come back later, whether it's, a few weeks later or a month later, and use the same characters and continue the thing on in the campaign. That actually happens a lot. But since Tenra, and a little bit before that too, the focus has been to, we play a lot of one-shots anyway. Why don't we have games that really pick that up, that don't have to have an advancement system that requires you to put 20-plus sessions into it to have your character level up? Why don't we have something that you can that doesn't focus so much on the leveling up, but focuses more on the play. And that was something that Tenra really did kick off. There were other games that were sort of thinking that direction, Japanese original games, but Tenra was the one that really blew the door off the hinges for that one. And then, honestly, recently too, the line of games that Shinobigami is in, that actually created a second revolution in Japan, where now so many games are coming out that are following that format. Small form factor, fit in the palm of your hand book with a replay in front and rules in back that you can just pick up at the bookstore, read on the train on an hour to your game session, come to the game session and be like, I just read the book, I understand it, and we're ready to play. Basically collapse that table time and get some friends together, and within 4 hours, you have characters, you have a story, maybe some German board gaming elements to keep everything really tight and online, but then at the end, you've got a very, very tight story. And that's something that's very common in Japan. There's a lot of one-shot culture, but nowadays, not only is there one-shot culture, but there's games that now support that one-shot culture as well.
Wow, that hadn't occurred to me as a sort of approach. I saw that you had mentioned another game in that genre done on G Plus today that follows that same factor.
Yes, Draco Rouge. Yeah, so Draco Rouge is interesting too. That basically, and Draco Rouge caught my attention for two reasons. One, hey, holy crap, it's the author of Maid and Golden Sky Stories. He's still doing stuff, and he's really prolific these days. I think he actually maybe quit or really with the opposite of enhanced. I don't know what that means. His day job to focus on writing. He came out with this game in a fantasy, extreme Heian era Japan, 980s magic and monsters. But this one's called Draco Rouge. And the thing is, like basically that format that I mentioned that Shinobigami promulgated, the small book, replay in front, rules in back, not a huge ass A4 size book with hundreds of pages you have to read, but just basically focus on play. Read the book in an hour. You're ready to put it on the table. You're ready to have fun with, in 3 to 4 hours with some friends. And you can, for that experience, you can walk away from the table, never play again, and still have had a very satisfying story. Other companies have started picking up, emulating that style. And Draco Rouge is one of them. Basically, it's another form-sized book. It's got the replay in the front and a little more setting, because the setting's a little bit interesting, and then the rules in the back. If you erased the label on it, I would have assumed it was made by the same people that did Shinobigami, actually. But in that regard, yes, it's a very tight game. It took us a little more rules flipping about because it's a very unique game, but it too was come together at the table. You're going to focus on these. It's a very strong scene setting game.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to take some turns. You're going to have basically 3 to 4 scenes in a game, and then the game's done. But you've had this thing where you walk away, and there's there's definitely like smoke rising from the table, and you're like, whoa, what the hell just happened? And you had this kind of really cool story and very interesting characters that you've gotten into. So basically, it takes a lot of the kind of getting into your character and the role playing moments and stuff like that, and really jams them into a few hour session and throws it at you. That game isn't for everyone all the time. Even Shinobigami, I love it and I played it and it's so easy to go into. And basically it is, even though I love all sorts of games in English and Japanese, that's a game that I still reach to if I'm like, I want to play, but I just don't have time to come up with anything. I'll either reach for Dungeon World or Shinobigami these days.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them produce incredible experiences very quickly. But I don't want to play them all the time. Like it's I wouldn't call it like a filler between real games, but I wouldn't say that once you play Shinobigami, you will be playing these games for the rest of your life.
Right.
Because I love the longer campaign games where you get to build things up over time and create a world with your friends. So it's not a replacement for that. It's not just like, this is the new way. You're going to do that all in 4 hours and walk away, and that's going to be the only way of gaming. No, but it's a very unique experience. It's basically going from like, I guess if German board games, there's going to be ones where the board's going to spread out all over the table. You're going to be there for several hours.
Right.
And you're going to go and do a social one that's going to be really quick and tight. No less fun, but a very different experience.
That's a very interesting comparison.
Yeah.
And it does bring me to this question. Now, of course, I've read through Tenra Bancho and Ryutama, and I've also looked at Golden Sky Stories, which,
mm-hmm.
I was like, Golden Sky Stories, it's a very light game. But when I sat down to look at it, I'm like, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of mechanics, a lot of parts going on here. And Double Cross is another one
mm-hmm.
that I looked at that actually Double Cross completely boggled my mind. There's so many mechanics in that game.
Yeah.
Is that like would you say is a characteristic of Japanese games, or is there a reason why they approach it in that way?
I got to say that even though a very narration-focused way of doing gaming is very new to Japan, it's games like Fiasco. Well, I'm actually helping the guys do Fiasco in Japanese, so it's going to be coming out later. But play tests with games like Fiasco, like Microscope, and like Primetime Adventures have gotten extremely positive reception. However, in Japan, these games haven't developed uniquely because even though there's been a lot of interesting developments in Japanese gaming, even though that's a very vague thing to say because there's so many, companies and people and humans involved in this venture. Two things that seem to stick is that there's always a game component. There's always going to be powers and dice rolling and stuff like that. Just dice are part of the RPG experience. So some games are playing with that, but and doing it less or doing it in new ways. But for the most part, you're going to have a gaming or numeric component to the game because that's just something that appeals to the people that have traditionally got into gaming or game design. And then the other thing is there's always a GM. And there's always that sort of GM makes the scenario and players follow.
Okay.
A lot of people have gone towards advice on how to make GM prep work easier and how to do that stuff, but still there's still a bit of a stratification, which I'm hoping to sort of bust down the walls a little bit with games like Fiasco and Dungeon World, where there's a very tight GM creates the scenarios, player follows along. Together you share a story, but there is a little bit more of but it's sort of in the GM's hands aspect to it, which makes the GM kind of a scary thing to aspire to. Like, oh, I could never be a GM. I could never, like anyone can be GM, dude. Seriously, like it's hard to find GMs in Japan, long story short, because they think it's a role that they don't deserve, or it's beyond their skill, or things like that. People it's harder to tell just people like, no, like all of us did it and we sucked at it maybe the first few times, but we got better at it. Give it a shot.
I'm actually going to interrupt you here for a second because
sure.
This kind of plays into something I was reading today, talking about particularly J-horror,
mm-hmm.
and they're comparing Western storytelling traditions in a 3-act structure to Japanese approaches to stories in the 4-act structure, and Western being much more about actions and intent and putting yourself in, whereas there's a sense of more incident occurring driven by external forces
Hmm.
in Japanese storytelling. Does that seem like a fair assessment, or am I kind of garbling that terribly?
Well, I'm not familiar as much with the Japanese literary and cinema qualities. I did see that article. I didn't read it. I saw it being shared around on Twitter the other day, specifically talking about like J-horror and the ring and stuff like that. But the interesting thing is this: while that may be the case, and that may be the case with anime, so a lot of the visual inspirations where Japanese games come from, Japanese RPGs actually come from a strong tradition of wanting to emulate the West. Like people thought that elves and knights and swords were cooler than, samurai stories. So they got into that, and therefore in the process they picked up things like, European heraldry, blah, 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 and the Western dramatic structure. So like in RPGs, when play hits a table, you're going to see a lot of them have the, the 5-act structure or whatever, where, it rises to a crescendo and then it has the denouement on the end. It emulates that. The structure for a lot of play is going to be that dramatic Western structure. The ways I've seen at the table anyway. When you go into the nuances, there may be more interesting. I haven't really seen enough. I can't really form an opinion either way. But a lot of the drama and structure of the stories, as well as the things that appear in the stories, were pulled from the West because that's what the original folks getting into RPGs were really interested in.
Yeah, and you mentioned emulation of the West and so on. What's your sense of the sort of the history of tabletops games appearing in Japan? How much that's influenced by the heavy development of video game RPGs? I mean, I love tracking the history of RPG publications. I mean, I've seen some Tenra, Gunslinger, and a few others, but I have no sense of what has gone on with the development of RPGs in Japan.
Yeah, it's I actually wrote a few articles on this way back when. I'm trying to dig them up now. But the very long story short, let me see if I can summarize it in the 5 minutes. So, did you know that mecha come from, were directly inspired by the bug hunting? Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers created mecha.
Oh, really?
Yes. And here's why. After World War II, back in the days before the internet, it would take about 10 to 15 years for a media that was released in one country to be translated and published in another. Well, Starship Troopers came out in the 50s or so. Then it took about 10, 15 years for it to come out into Japanese literature. 5 years of seeding, promulgation, people telling friends, it getting picked up by, and other friends, blah, 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 blah. This idea of not robots, but people in robotic suits became bigger, bigger, bigger. And literally, not even, the timelines add up. Within 3 years, Gundam was on TV.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, literally, the mecha genre comes from Starship Troopers because of inspiration from that idea of mecha suits or mechanized suits and the translation lag. Well, same thing happened with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings came out, translation lag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And where in the U.S. people were inspired by it and doing fantasy gaming in the 70s, it didn't really come out here and get popular until the very early 80s. And same thing with Dungeons & Dragons. Some people in universities found that there were people in the U.S. playing these games that were based on Lord of the Rings, and so they started coming out, and they started coming out in the mid-'80s. And so, I guess the first translation of Dungeons & Dragons was early 80s. It came out in the U.S. in the early 70s. And then shortly after, the first Japanese original RPG, Sword World, came out around that time. Here's the problem. Well, it's not a problem, but it's an interesting thing. Well, it is kind of a problem. The problem is this. When did we have role-playing games? Well, in the 70s, super late 60s if you were in Wisconsin, but 70s and early 80s, TV sucked. Everyone went outside and rode their BMX bikes. Video games were basically splotches on the screen. Video games are awesome, and I remember playing the Atari 2600 with my friends, but they were like squares shooting squares and eating squares. But fantasy, like role-playing games, were this huge, epic thing that you can get into with your friends and go really deep and have all these rules and worlds and things like that. Well, unfortunately, because of that translation lag that brought Dungeons & Dragons and Lord of the Rings late to Japan, Dungeons & Dragons didn't come out until literally the year before Nintendo dropped, the first Famicom in Japan. So we had 15 years at least of seed time before Nintendo came along and like basically just pushed like the next generation directly into consoles. So there's a lot of like people like doing, oh, I love consoles, but I also love tabletop RPGs. There's a lot of that crossover. Well, in Japan, right at the time where the fertile ground was starting to seed with this whole tabletop RPG thing in universities, in the university culture, in mostly in Tokyo, but in Osaka too, and Kobe. Well, Famicom came along and just ground everything to dust. like you can now play on your own in your house. Well, the other thing too that was interesting is that Nintendo's culture at the time of game design was so cutthroat. Not cutthroat by our standards, it's like you fail, you fire,
Right.
but so cutthroat in like teams trying to find the new idea that they would do a lot of research. They would look at things that were unique in their country and other countries. Well, someone stumbled along RPGs, and Dragon Quest came along, which basically was, as close to someone they could, someone was picked up, saw either Dungeons and Dragons or Sword World, said, this is great. This will save our team during the next competition to see what the next game is going to be published. They have these things called, the HP are straight pulled into Japanese, SP straight pulled into Japanese, and they published Dragon Quest, which was a huge success, and started the entire RPGs on consoles thing. There was nothing like that before that. So anyway, that's why if you say the word RPG in Japan, everyone knows what you're talking about. You're talking about Final Fantasies and Dragon Quests. Then if you say, oh, no, we played at a table, everyone's like, what? What are you talking about? I don't understand. Only a fringe element understands that. Luckily, they're getting a little more popular these days, especially with the explosion of tabletop games, board games. But still, it was just such just a chance of history right at the time that the fertile ground was being seeded with this tabletop gaming culture. That's when Famicom came out in Japan. So people didn't have this generation to play these games before they came out. No, it was just like one came out and then like a few months later, boom, here comes Famicom and everything else is dashed.
Wow. I hadn't put all of those timelines together. That's really amazing.
Yeah. Things get interesting in the 90s. That's when there was one or two original Japanese games, but they were mostly sort of like, let's make the blank in Japanese. Let's make the Dungeons and Dragons in Japanese. Let's make a few unique ones came out in the late 80s and early 90s. But then at that point, Fear, that one that did Tenra, started doing some experimenting with game structures and game styles that were uniquely Japanese, that were where they kind of thought about like, what is a role-playing game? They were inspired by some games like Dungeons and Dragons and Torg, but then they took them in unique directions. And that in the 90s, that's sort of things started happening, and then the timeline starts diverging from there. But yeah, that early timeline is kind of interesting.
This episode of the Gauntlet Podcast is brought to you by our plausibly deniable friends at Nocturnal Media.
This time we're talking about Cold Shadows, narrative espionage role-playing. Cold Shadows had a successful Kickstarter a few months ago, but they've got the backer kit open now, and if anyone's interested in doing pre-orders, they can do that. Cold Shadows is less James Bond and spycraft, and it's much more the John le Carré novels. That's the tagline that grabbed me. I grew up on those. My dad taught international relations, and they had all these novels around with some of the first big adult books I read. Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy. It really wants to emulate spy stories that are about trust and betrayal and deception and the job of being a spy. So we're getting Graham Greene, some of the Ludlum questions about crosswork and betrayal and so on. And if you've ever seen the really excellent British TV show Sandbaggers, that is amazing look into that life. I've read some stuff about MI6 during this whole period, and it's just fascinating world. Now, this is focused kind of on Cold War feel, but it can be also used for modern games. It's got some elements to just bring that question of how do we track trust? How do we track cover our assets and so on? They did well enough in the Kickstarter that they have an expansion called Cities in Shadow, which is a cities book for it. It's all based on John Wick's Blood and Honor, which is a samurai role-playing game about the trials and tribulations of being under an authority yet having to do these dangerous things. You can find all of this at coldshadows.backerkit.com, and you'll find a button there for pre-orders. You can get the soft cover of the main book. You can get the soft cover of the Cities in Shadow expansion. They've got dice and token sets there and special story pack cards. and that's going to be open until the end of May. It's a really neat game, and I'm very excited. I backed it in the Kickstarter, and I can't wait to see the final product.
Thanks again to our co-conspirators at Nocturnal Media for supporting the Gauntlet podcast.
So, in the sort of the modern field of JRPGs, let's say the last 3 or 4 years, besides the ones that we've seen brought over, one or two that you think are really interesting or doing something striking in the Japanese scene or striking more generally?
Well, one thing that's been interesting, and it's not going to be a game, because it's not necessarily games cause revolutions here. They have. Early 2000s, a game called Al Shard came along by the same guy that did Tenra, which was a very Final Fantasy rules light, kind of exalted-like game with D6s, but not nearly as technically complicated. But that home system that it created set the standards for how a game is written that are even being followed today.
Oh, interesting. So
that was a revolution. Shinobigami was definitely a revolution. It came out in a small form factor because the author's goals were, we want to make a very tight experience that you can put on a bookshelf. Someone can come along, pick it up, not know what it's about, but still take it home, play it, and then basically they wanted a generation shift for RPGs that they could be slipped in next to the fantasy fiction stuff that were in bookstores without having to have people know about them or find out about them by happenstance. So those were definitely game things that happened. And there's one or two interesting games that came out recently that are cool. But I would say the most unique Japanese thing that happened in gaming these days is the success of what they call replays, video replays specifically. So replay is, and I threw that word around a couple times for your audience. Basically, replay, traditionally in the U.S., well, let's talk about the 90s and early 2000s, a tabletop role-playing game would come out, and then within a few months, if this is a big company, it would have to have supplements in the treadmill. It'd have to have, the first supplement would either have to drop at the same time or drop really soon after, and then you have these supplements coming out that explain more of the world or whatever. In Japan, it was always the core game comes out, and then a replay comes out, either immediately or very soon after, and the replay is, usually the author and some friends or some luminaries in the RPG world. They came together, played a session, someone transcribed the session word for word. Maybe they left out, a shimoneta, a dick joke or two, and maybe cut out some side chatter, but some side chatter is in there. So you understand, and when a joke is made, like that, someone says something out of character, that stuff is still included in there. So you basically have this transcript of what a fun, interesting, and very human role-playing session is supposed to look like.
Wow.
So more than anything else, that sort of, rather than seeing a scenario or getting advice, but to see word line by line how people interact with this game is really important. Well, very recently, let's say within the last 10 years, people have been doing them online, not showing their table, but rather taking the transcript. I guess these are people like, college students or something like that with a lot of free time, taking that transcript and then using dating sim tools to have a picture on top and then text in the bottom.
Oh my gosh.
I'll send you a couple links so you can post them and some are actually, these days, there's actually anime voice actors and actresses that will read them and have visualizations at the same time. But a lot of them are basically just like Vocaloids. So the robotic voices reading each part, and each part will have a different style of Vocaloid, a girl Vocaloid, a guy Vocaloid, an evil guy Vocaloid, etc. But these came out, maybe with about last 8 years, but 5 years ago or so, they started really churning out with funny, interesting ones, specifically about Call of Cthulhu.
Huh.
Call of Cthulhu is set in modern Japan. That was 5 years ago. Today, the undisputed #1 best-selling RPG in Japan is Call of Cthulhu. Straight up. It was a direct result of that. When my friend Okada, who, Ryutama author, and he runs a game cafe, he runs the first game cafe in Japan. When Golden Week and other holidays come along, high school kids, college kids flood in going, we saw this thing on our phone on the way to school that looked really awesome. It's called Call of Cthulhu. Can someone run it for us? Here's money. So he's like, if nothing else is going on, people are saturated with running or playing Call of Cthulhu. Also, Double Cross. There's been a really good Double Cross replays as well. So there's a lot of interest in Double Cross as well. But Call of Cthulhu, it came out in Japan a long time ago. It simmered, but then just for some reason, the person doing those replays was really interested in Call of Cthulhu, so they did a lot of Call of Cthulhu ones. Specifically they don't set them in historic, they set them in modern, contemporary Japan, usually with high school kids or, other anime style, like, high school kids / college kids and stuff. Yeah, and because of that, not only that has caused a revolution. A new generation of gamers has been born. High school kids and college kids who never would have seen these games in a bookstore, but someone happened to find a funny link on YouTube or Nico Nico Doga, which is Japanese YouTube, on their way to school because it was linked on something that they were looking at. They watched it, they thought it was funny, they shared it with their friends, they thought it was funny, let's try this. More than just a cool game that came out and caught people's eyes, this new media, this new format, this new way of sharing your gaming experience. And the guy was just sharing his game. He wasn't recruiting. He was just sharing his gaming experience. Now, people have created these replays to recruit or to generate interest in the games with various levels of quality, polish, and things like that. But, it was just a new media, new form, and that created a new generation of gamers. So even though the front wave, you can say, it's because of Call of Cthulhu. Yes and no. It's Call of Cthulhu was the game that was promulgated first in these replays, but it wasn't just because of Call of Cthulhu. It was because of these visual video replays.
Wow.
So that has been a revolution.
You've absolutely blown my mind.
Yeah.
That is one of the coolest things I have heard in a long time. I'm blown away by that.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's other games now that are, like I mentioned, those Shinobigama style one-shot games that are coming out where they're like, well, we want to sell and recruit more people. We're going to make a one-shot superhero game, and the rules are percentile, just like Call of Duty. So it's had that much influence where people are going like, what's a way we can put Call of Cthulhu style rules in this game to entice the new generation that's coming in to play their game.
Wow. So we've gone kind of long, but I want to see, is there anything that we haven't hit, and particularly any projects or things that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I don't have a lot to promote myself, but please check out Tenra and Ryutama if you haven't already. Those are both products of our minds and hearts that we love. We're also working on supplements from them that are coming out shortly.
Oh, wow.
Ryutama by the end of the year, and Tenra I'm a little behind on releasing some stuff. It's all in layout right now. And Shinobigami is on its way a little bit later than we expected. It was supposed to come out last Christmas, but the final PDF should be out within the next 2 months. But you can pre-order it and get, books and stuff. Shinobigami is a very exciting game. You're going to be able to, again, with friends, no prep, just pick up a book, read it for a few minutes, and then be able to collapse that time float and be able to run at your tables very quickly. It triggered a revolution in Japan. I'm very interested in seeing what it does in the U.S. and other English-speaking countries.
Yeah, I hope that we have it before Gen Con. I might try to take that to Games on Demand at Gen Con this year. That would be a great
I'll
option.
Absolutely get that. We'll absolutely have the PDF ready.
PDF is fine. That'd be great. Andy, thank you so much. This is
no problem.
Just an absolute joy.
Anytime.
So much stuff that I had no idea about. This is the Gauntlet Podcast. I want to thank everyone for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. You can also check out gauntlet-rpg.com. That's where we have links to all of the various podcasts, including Plus One Forward, which is a PBTA podcast, the main podcast which you're listening to now. We have the Comic Strip AP, which are micro actual plays, as well as Distant Realities, which is about Dungeon World. We also have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/gauntlet. Andy, is there any place that we can follow you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Diamond Sutra, one word. And then from there, that kind of spirals out of control, and you can find everything from there. But I also blog on Plus. But you can find my ramblings about Japanese RPGs on j-rpg.com. And also, you can see about our games on Kotodama Heavy Industries, KOTOHI.com. Kotohi.com.
Awesome. Thanks once again for joining us today.
Thank you, Lowell.